Welcome to Triple Your Grant Income in 90 Minutes, where you will discover the 5 strategies to triple your chances of winning those grants, and in turn bring in extra funds so that your community group can make a difference. If you apply these strategies, you will increase your chances of being successful and also your chances of getting what you ask for. This presentation is for you if you are looking for funds for your community organisation or group. You may have an idea for a project and are looking for some external funds to make it happen, and there's a grant out there that fits what you want to do. This presentation is for you if you want to get your head around what funding bodies are looking for and where to find this valuable piece of information in the funding guidelines. If your project doesn't meet the objectives of your funder, there's no point in wasting energy putting in an application. This presentation is for you if you want to increase your chances of getting as much funds as possible from these grants. I recently visited a group that was looking for ways to bring in more grant funding. I asked them about a particular grant, and they said they did get funding for projects, usually around $2,000. They were amazed when I said that a group I work with usually gets $20,000. They had been fearful about applying for more in case they didn't get anything, and this thinking is not unusual when it comes to community groups, and it's the wrong thinking. This presentation is for you if you want a grant submission strategy that you can apply to all your applications. What if you could use one technique for all your grant applications? What led me to create this presentation? My name is Pat Grosse. I moved to Australia in 2000 from the UK, and it certainly feels like I have lived 2 lifetimes in one. I have had 2 career paths with one common link, and that link has been funding. In the UK, I organised courses on applying for funding and delivering grants for projects. Then went on to manage a multi-million pound project that I inherited from people who had written the original submission but were no longer there to refer to. One of the first things I had to do was to renegotiate the delivery plan, and along with the executive officer put systems in place so that we could manage the project that we had successfully applied for. In Australia, I worked for a funding body before becoming independent, jumping over the fence into writing submissions for community projects. I am strongly passionate about community managing themselves. I've seen all kinds of applications, both in the UK and in Australia, and have been frustrated by the missing information that could have made all the difference. I have sat on both sides of the funding fence in 2 hemispheres. Today I wish to share some useful tips with you to improve your chances of success. So in a bit more detail, here's what I've done. I started organising funding workshops back in the UK for public, voluntary, community and education sector organisations looking for grants from the European Union. One programme, EU Funding for Beginners, started off as attracting only 7 people at the first workshop, which was held during the first week of December, not the best time of year to introduce a new workshop. But it became a sustainable part of our operation, with many workshops being oversubscribed again and again, year in, year out. We also introduced funding workshops specifically for certain grants. When I left the position, I went on to manage a large training fund, not fully aware when I first started of the enormity of the systems that had yet to be put in place to manage the funds to be allocated across a number of university projects through an application process. We were developing criteria whilst ensuring that we remained within the conditions of our funding agreement. I was also involved in assessing funding submissions with the regional government office. It is this experience that introduced me to the wide variety of application styles, from the complicated, verbose, off-the-point applications, where we had to reread the application over and over again to find the answers we were looking for, to the easy-to-read, well-constructed, answer the question, direct-to-the-point responses. This experience certainly opened my eyes. When I came to Australia, I did not expect that I would once again be on the front line with funding. I became employed in a regional office for adult community education, planning for and supporting adult education in the community. This role was twofold. On the one hand, carrying out first-line assessment of funding applications. On the other hand, applying for grants to support regional professional development for committees, staff, trainers and volunteers. In this role, I was also involved in developing grant criteria. I have been self-employed in my own company since 2010, enjoying the prospect of supporting community organisations to develop their capabilities. Our support has been through various activities including grant writing for organisations with whom we have built our rapport. One client has just reached $1 million in grant funding over a period of 18 months. So here it is. In 2 hemispheres, I have organised funding workshops, delivered funding briefings, assessed funding submissions, managed funded projects and developed funding criteria. Testimonials. Here are a couple of recent testimonials. Antonella Smith. I enjoy a close working relationship with my clients. I get to know who they are, how they work and what they want. This makes it easy for me to write applications on their behalf. My relationship with the North East Multicultural Association in Victoria has brought in funding for a variety of projects, from aged care to festivals, community gardens, storytelling, a whole mix of topic areas. Karen Marsh, St John's Village. I have known Karen for a few years, and together we have worked on a variety of funded projects, not just with St John's, but also in the adult education area. This is an example of large funding and also of funding for 2 different projects which combine to create a larger project. Examples of recent grant successes. I've been successful in applying for grants, both large and small. For some community groups, $20,000 is a lot of money. I recently took one organisation past the $1 million mark in less than 18 months through a series of small and then larger grants. It can be just as difficult applying for small grants as for large grants. Small grants tend to be more competitive, so the responses to the criteria need to stand out. On the whole, larger grants require more evidence of planning, support, and longer-term sustainable outcomes. The grants have been diverse, from a range of funding bodies and a variety of application forms. So why this presentation? I have come across community groups that for a number of reasons fail to attract enough funds to make their community project the success it deserves to be. They have a good idea based on real needs, but they don't get the argument over as closely as they could, or they don't consider how much it really costs to run a project and only apply for part of the real cost. Like the group that was only attracting $2,000 for their much-needed project and were finding it difficult to deliver the project on $2,000. Yet I could see straight away how they could have made their submission more relevant with a more realistic budget They could easily have got $10,000. In this presentation, I will provide you with some advice and tips on making a strong application that will get the attention of the funding bodies, and with a plan that can be put into action when the funds come in. So here are 5 strategies that we're going to cover to increase your chances of successful grants. Strategy 1. Unpack the guidelines. Yes, there is a common structure. 2. Plan your project realistically. 3. Budget, budget, budget. 4. Put quality and trust into your application. And 5. Put the application together, tying up the loose ends. All grants may be written differently, but they do follow a common thread. The words are different, the order and shape of questions are different, but they all lead to a destination that gets the applicant to define what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they will do it, and for how much. Within the structure, there are clues about what the funder is looking for. Can you find their objectives that they have to meet? If you are having difficulties in getting the funds you desperately need, if you follow these 5 strategies, you will double, even triple your chances of success. Strategy 1. Unpack the guidelines. Have you ever dived into writing a funding application, got right into it, and then found you'd overlooked a vital piece of information? For example, your group isn't eligible, or the grant won't pay for staff costs. The first step is to unpack the guidelines. If you don't do this properly, you're likely to miss something important. There's not much worse than spending a lot of time and energy convincing your colleagues and yourself that this is the answer to your prayers. Putting effort into answering the questions and then, pow, it hits you. You've been wasting your time. So let's unpack the guidelines. Identify the funder's objectives and outcomes. These are the goals and the consequences. It is far better to sit down and methodically tick off these key questions. Is there a policy mentioned in the preamble or questions? If so, read it. What policy action does this grant address? What are the outcomes required in this policy statement? Which of these outcomes is the funding document referring to, and how do these link with the policy? Do your outcomes match with the outcomes mentioned in the guidelines? If not, then you may be barking up the wrong tree. Sometimes the grant guidelines don't refer to a policy document, but you will always find the outcomes that they are looking for. Funding bodies are not just going to give you money. They have their own targets. Maybe these targets are better defined by reading any background policy documents they refer to. Get your head around. What is the imperative they are trying to achieve? Can your project meet these objectives and outcomes? If not, stop. Look elsewhere. Don't try to put a square peg into a round hole. Summarize what kinds of grants can be funded. Do your homework. Read the guidelines and read them again. Many funding bodies refer to previous rounds and frequently ask questions for people to get a clear picture and to give an indication of what dollar or pound or whatever currency level of grants were funded for previously. Or maybe identify what not to apply for. An example of funding is community strengthening grants may be available for up to $20,000. But if you look at the list of what was funded previously, you'll get a good idea of the kinds of projects that were funded, but also the amounts that they were funded for. And sometimes you'll be given an average. So a $20,000 grant, the average may be $6,000. So if your community group or organisation is applying to this grant line and you have been getting $2,000, then I would certainly be looking at aiming at least for the average and possibly more. And with confidence and a good plan, I would be applying for up to the limit. Understand what grant funds are available and what they can be spent on. Become familiar with what the grant funds can be spent on and what they can't be spent on. Unpacking the guidelines to look at fit. Timelines. Submission deadline, project timeline. Review the eligibility criteria. Can your group apply? Do you need an auspice agency or a partner? Do you have the capacity to deliver? If what you want to do doesn't fit, stop and become familiar with the application form. Now, timelines. Do not leave it to the last minute to put together your application. By doing that, you may run into trouble with letters of support, quotes, or other supporting information that you might need. You may also need to run the submission past people who might want to make changes, and that can be quite lengthy. You will also need to consider the time frame start to finish for the project. Can you deliver within the time frame set out by the funding guidelines? Can the project wait for a start date in 6 months' time, where some grants run on a 6-month application process? Review the eligibility criteria. Can your group apply? Do you need an auspice agency to apply on your behalf, or a partner or two? When it comes to eligibility criteria, maybe local government is the primary target group that the funding body is wanting to apply for the grants. Or perhaps local government isn't allowed to apply, but they're interested. These are good opportunities to build a good relationship with local government or with any other stakeholder out there who you could see a good quid pro quo relationship happening to improve what's happening in your community. Non-incorporated groups may not be able to be the budget holder and may require an auspice organisation. That's a good opportunity to build a relationship with an incorporated organisation who can take responsibility on your behalf and accountability with the funding body. Beware of last-minute partnerships, because there may be issues of culture, authority and agendas down the line if you haven't done your homework. Examples of projects that have gone horribly wrong have been where the submission was put together within a short time frame and the partners, although they favoured the idea in principle, found out that the project was different to their expectations when it began. Other examples include partners with their own agendas that didn't come to light until after the project started. If you're going to work in partnership, ensure that all parties have a common understanding and ability to enter into a formal contract or memorandum of understanding once the project is funded. It's one thing to put a letter of support together, although some organisations are very careful not to cite support as a partner, otherwise the application would have to go through an approval process within their own organisation before supporting the application. And quite another to commit time and resources to a project that you might not have control over. Do you have the capacity to deliver? If you're going for a larger grant, please be sure that you have the capacity to deliver. Larger grants could mean employing staff, which will have implications for your human resources policies and procedures. Make sure your committee is ready just in case you get the funding. Get them involved from the start. So what if what you want to do doesn't fit? Stop right now. If you can't tick any of these boxes mentioned earlier, so if your objectives and the outcomes don't correlate to the funding body, you may have some objectives and outcomes specifically for your organization, but the overall objectives and outcomes must match what the funding body is looking for. If what you've looked at previous guidelines and projects and what can and can't be funded and you still can't make them fit what you want to do, if the timelines are not right, if you're not eligible or you can't find a partner who is eligible, or if you're finding that maybe you don't have the capacity to deliver, then consider walking away. Stop chasing those yellow taxis. A taxi will come along that's going exactly in the direction that you're wanting. That's the one that you should be stopping for. And finally, you'll be referring to the application form quite a bit. Separate the questions. Put them into a word processing program so that you can edit, copy and paste whilst maintaining formatting. The funds may pay for all the project or may be looking for commitment from the organisation and partners via match funding. Be mindful of just how far you can go with the funding that you are applying for. And what I mean by that is that you may have a project with many components, but the project will only fund a certain part of it. So you would need to consider where you would get the funding to complete the rest. An idea is perhaps when there's events being put forward and you're developing the events or developing products, but the funding actually doesn't pay for the launch. You could be developing a new training program, but the funding doesn't pay for the training. Strategy 2. Plan your project realistically. We'll start with purpose and need. Confirm the project fits with your purpose and your organisational objectives and plan. Be very clear about the need for the activities you are applying for. Check with the funding body representative or attend a briefing. Make sure your idea is not normal business. Is it innovative? So what do I mean? So you've decided you could do this, but before you start, check one thing. Does this project fit with your organisational purpose and strategic or business planning documents? Or are you still chasing taxis? Not all community groups have an up-to-date strategic or business plan, but they do have a purpose set out in their constitution, this being their reason for being. Refer back to this. Make sure you're not shooting off into tangents, putting a lot of energy into projects and activities that do not relate to the reason why your organisation is in existence. What's the need? My response when responding to queries about potential projects that people put forward in my funding body days. They would ask me a question with an idea and I would come back with them and say, what's the need? And then they would give me an answer and then I would come back and say, what's the need? Until we manage to get to the need, the reason for the project. This is a good exercise to go through and to try out to establish the need. Needs are better than nice to haves, especially when they can be quantified. Number one rule, Have you consulted with the community? Have you checked the available data? Have you spoken to other stakeholders? Quantitative and qualitative support a funding application. Once you've read the frequently asked questions and guidelines, and perhaps you've been to a briefing, you are then looking for affirmation that you are on the right track. So you may call a representative of the funding body, the person who is listed in the funding guidelines. And this is where the probity principle comes into play. The representative will give you a generic response. They have to be seen to be fair to everybody. So you might not get the answer you wanted about your project specifically, but a trick may be to ask a generic hypothetical question. And don't be surprised if you see the answer that you were given in the next updated version of the frequently asked questions. If you're looking at frequently asked questions, which you should do by the way, make sure that you're not just reading them at the beginning of the application process timeline, but that you keep checking for updates, because these frequently asked questions will be continually updated with the answers to questions that people bring up at briefings or by talking to the desk officer representative. One trap people fall into is to try and fund existing jobs that are considered recurrent. So the funding body deems them to have income from elsewhere. Funding is for projects. Projects are time-based. So it is the expectation that people are appointed or contracted for the project specifically and within the project time frame. This does not mean that a person who works part-time cannot be considered for additional hours over and above their normal appointment to run funded projects. There are also positions that are dependent on projects, and they are not recurrent positions. I have come across organisations that have not applied for funding because they've got confused and they saw that funds cannot be used for normal staff and immediately thought that they were ineligible. The big question people ask is, what is innovation? What the funding body is looking for is a project that will lead to change. It will be something new for the organisation, for the region, or for the wider community. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't try something that's been done elsewhere. If you can build a case for the need, then the activity will be new to your organisation or community and will require change. This is innovation, just as much as a system-wide or community-wide change. What the funding body doesn't want is to fund something that is business as usual. If you had a project which had come to an end and you are now looking for further funds, the funding body will be looking for evidence that there is a need to continue and that the need to continue will be to take the original project to the next step, not more of the same. Projects have a finite time, budget, and target outputs and outcomes. They are not recurrent business. They may lead to recurrent business, but for the purpose of the exercise, projects have boundaries. Innovation is a complicated word. Is this project innovative for your community or organisation? If it is a follow-up, does it add a new dimension? Because funders expect projects to be sustainable after the end of their funding cycle. Let's have a look at project management. What will it take to achieve our outcomes? Plan out what needs to be done, when and by whom. Incorporate project management and evaluation where applicable. Break the plan down into stages. Identify what work will be carried out by volunteers or what will be organisational contributions. Consider, have we got the right partners and what will be their roles? And check the plan with colleagues. Start by considering what will it take to achieve the outcomes you are promising. Use this as the basis for your project plan. The project plan is an important part of the funding application. How, who, and when you are going to deliver the components of the project. When you put this plan together, consider project management and evaluation as components of the overall plan. By project management, I mean show in the plan what arrangements you have made to manage the project. Will you have reference groups? Will you have reporting milestones? Will you be employing staff, therefore going through the recruitment process? The plan defines what it will take to achieve your outcomes. These are the consequences of your outcomes, and provide evidence of what you have learnt. These are the outputs of deliverables which are achieved through tasks. An output or deliverable might be a new website. An outcome might be 20% increase in the number of people taking part in events as a consequence of visiting the website and finding information about the events. An easy way to brainstorm your project plan if you don't have project management software is to use post-it notes. Assign a task to a note with who might be responsible and how long it might take, and arrange these post-it notes on a table or whiteboard as a timeline, and then transfer this to a document. Break the plan down into stages. There are some underpinning processes that should be included in the project plan for all projects. So, consider the project reference team. When will the project reference team meet? Do you have a consultant? So there will be a process inbuilt for the appointment of the consultant. What about including evaluation? An advantage of breaking down into stages was two advantages. One is that it's easier for a funding body to see that the plan is carefully being put together. But also, if the funding body can't fund everything, and there are some funding bodies who try to fund as many applicants as possible, but the dollars don't stretch far enough, and so they may actually consider part funding projects. So if you've got a project in stages, they may actually come to you, and I know because this has happened, and fund all but the last stage. It's either that or there's nothing. Strategy 3. Budget, budget, budget. Identify what the project will fund and what costs need to come from elsewhere. Get quotes where possible. Identify direct costs as well as organizational overheads. Don't underprice, be realistic. The budget is an important indicator of what you are applying for. When I have not been able to understand an application or something didn't seem right, I would go to the budget page to get my answers. For example, for a grant that we were administering that would not permit training, the applicant would go out of their way to talk about a skills building program, and then in the budget request funds for training. The budget is also an important indicator of how much planning the applicant has done. Have they properly estimated the amount of time it would take to carry out the project? Have the time fractions for project staff and their salaries been adequately costed? I am aware of projects that have been turned down simply because the amounts that they have put in the budget for staff time did not appear to match what the funding body considered it would take to successfully manage that project that they were proposing. And invariably the funding body will request a breakdown of staff and non-staff costs to help build the picture. The number one action is to figure out what the funding criteria says about what will and won't be funded. Things to watch out for are staff costs. Sometimes funding doesn't extend to any kind of staff or contractor costs, and other times funds staff costs over and above normal working hours or allows for consultants. A recent example was a funding grant that didn't fund launches. In this particular case, it was about developing a new product that could be applied and used in the community. But it did not go as far as the launch. So in this project, the community organisation had to find additional funding to launch the product in the community. Some projects will require match funding. Match funding is usually directed as a formula percentage of the grant fund, presented as 2-to-1, 1-to-1, 1-to-2. On a 2-to-1 basis, it means for the amount that they fund you, you would require 50% of that as match funding. So if you're looking for a $10,000 grant on a 2-to-1 basis, then you'll need to find $5,000 of equivalent funding, cash or in kind. And sometimes the guidelines can get prescriptive when the requirement is to say 50% of the match funding has to be cash. So for a $15,000 project, the funding body will fund $10,000. You will have to find a cash contribution of at least $2,500 and in-kind contribution of at least $2,500. As long as you can cover the minimum core contribution amounts, your match funding can be more than the required amount. Sometimes you think you can't apply for more funding because you can't identify enough match funding when you're putting the application together. Trust me, I've been there. By the time we got to the end of the project, we had double the amount of in-kind match funding than we could have guessed when we put in the application. So be generous to yourselves. Don't be tight in thinking that we can only get this much volunteer support or this much in terms of organisational support. Because by the time that you complete the project, you'll find that you've got more than you need. Quotes show that you've done your homework, so don't leave them until the last minute. They show realistic pricing. Always good to plan for quotes, especially if you're looking at capital improvement projects. Because when capital improvements projects come up, the ones that are ready to go are the easiest to consider for funding. Always refer to your project plan to get an idea of what the direct costs will be. These will be in the form of salaries, travel, materials, related expenses, project auditing, administration that's directly related to the project. There are other costs that are hidden in your organization's operations. These are the organizational overheads. They will include costs such as those costs that contribute to the management of the organization, which provide the foundation for your organization to carry out the project. Administration, finance, management, accommodation, facilities, the costs to keep the doors open. It's useful for your bookkeeper or treasurer to analyse these organisational costs. Start with the profit and loss for the previous year to calculate a percentage of income that needs to be costed to all activities to contribute to these organisational overheads, and that can be directly attributed to the project. So then include organisational overheads as one of your items in the budget. These factors will assist in coming up with a price for the project that is realistic and not underpriced. And remember, the budget fills in the gaps and exposes the quality of the application. So avoid the oily rag. Make sure that all project costs are identified. Go back to the plan. Make sure that everything in the plan is costed in the budget. Show realistic salary costs. Don't underestimate. Don't underestimate the available match funding, especially the in-kind, the volunteer support, the organisational support. Quotes, avoid guesswork. Find out your organisational overheads formula and apply it. And if you don't have one, get your treasurer or bookkeeper to put one together. And submit a realistic budget. You need to cost your projects properly. Strategy 4. Put quality and trust into your application. So ensure that your management committee supports and signs off the application. Present the application to the committee and get the president or chair to authorise a submission. Make sure they understand what they are asking for and the implications. It could mean changes to staff profile. You become a more professional business. I once found myself managing a project that the committee wasn't aware of, and they hadn't been presented with the funding application, so they say. The chair had signed off the funding application, but there had been a change of committee in the meantime. So it was actually quite an embarrassing start to the project. Get someone to check the typos, the formatting, the logical flow, the gaps in your arguments. Writers can be too close. Their strength may be in the creative thinking, and they're not necessarily focusing on the grammar. So if you're writing the submission, don't be precious. Get somebody else to check, because you're too close to it. Get letters of support and include the role or contribution that partners may be making. Allow time for support letters. Stakeholders may have to go through governance processes, especially local government. So it may take time to get the letter through various committees. Consider and plan for risks. Funding guidelines may ask for a risk plan, especially the higher the grant funds. So don't assume. Even the simplest, most unlikely risks shouldn't be ruled out. Sometimes the risk planning can identify project elements that have been overlooked. For example, what if the community isn't interested in the project? Apart from not having done the homework in the first place to see if there is a real need, it could be that the project needs to be promoted properly from the start. Hence, the project plan should include a marketing element. Oops, you hadn't thought of that. Which equates to time, availability of resources, and costs of materials. And if you don't plan for this, the money isn't likely to be available. What if partners don't do what they say they will do? Then the project plan will incorporate the development and signing of MOUs, memorandums of understanding, or contracts at the start. These are examples of where thinking about risk and putting together a good risk plan can add to the quality of the application and signal to the funding body that this is a quality project. Do you have a good communication plan? A good indicator of a quality project is to show a good structure for communication. The project team, with the project management or reference group, between the partners, or with the community. Does your funding submission indicate that you have considered communication? Building evaluation. Last but not least, building an evaluation shows that you want to learn from the project. How well was it managed? Was it needed? How well did it respond to the need? How did the partners work together? What learnings can we take forward? What evidence is there for a further project? If you don't build evaluation into your project plan, how can you measure how successful it was? Put your application together. Strategy 5, tying up the loose ends. Now the first thing you need to do is to create a catchy title. And this can be quite difficult and probably a lengthy part of the application process. Some examples of titles that I've used have been Indigo Fireflies, which was for a project preparing for bushfires. Burnley Backyard, a community partnership with a community garden and a neighbourhood house. NEMAC, an example of using an abbreviation, North East Multicultural Aged Care Connections. Sometimes abbreviated acronyms can be the way to go. Lone Rangers, and that was for a project for single men living in the bush. Migrant's Journey, and that was used for storytelling. Sometimes it's just not easy and you can't come up with something that's catchy, so just put a title in anyway, and remember that the title is something that you will be using throughout the lifetime of the project and afterwards when you refer back to it. 2. Populate with organisational information, auspicing bodies if you need one, and partners if they're relevant. And usually it's easy if you've got somebody who can just put that information into the funding application document as soon as it's available. So then that allows you the time to plan and to write the content of the application. Why, what, where, who, when and how. Now these questions will come up in various shapes and forms in every application. Play the game. Once you find a new application form, look for the why, what, where, who, when and how questions. Incorporate evaluation and risk plan. Why plan for evaluation? How will you know if you've been successful otherwise? Even if the criteria doesn't ask for evaluation, or if the evaluation format is focused, for example, a healthy aging grant wanted you to plan evaluation around tasks, think about what you want to do with the information you get from evaluating your project. We missed a grant because the previous project did not incorporate sufficient evaluation to demonstrate the need for the next stage. There was no quantifiable or qualitative information from that first project that said we need to take this to the next stage, this is why. And so we had to spend a whole year collecting evidence from other means so that we could put together the next application cycle afterwards, an application. So we missed a whole year that we could have taken that original project to the next stage. We did get the fund the next time round, and the organisation learnt a valuable lesson about evaluating projects. As already mentioned, building the risk plan, not just for identifying missing components of the project plan, but to plan for when things go wrong or might go wrong and to avoid the worst of the damage. Watch out for word limits. Use bullet points. How many people have found themselves in full flow and then stopped mid-word because you've reached your word count? It's good to use word processing package that will help you keep an eye on your word limit and helps with formatting. Whereas some forms just don't let you put bullets straight into the answers, if you prepare your answer in a word processing document with bullets, it will copy straight over. Language. Keep it simple. Again, examples of people using complex wording. They didn't seem to understand what they were talking about. So when we were looking at submissions, we had to look for clues elsewhere. It took up a lot of time and energy. The simplest, easiest are the most direct answers to the questions. I can remember a session in the UK where we were moderating grant submissions against criteria. It was a tedious exercise, especially when we read whole documents to identify the responses and to be fair to the applicants. I came across one response that answered question by question. It was so easy. I thought I'd done something wrong. But the other person who also moderated the same application gave a similar score to me. It was so simple yet effective. The information was in the one place, the right place. Make sure the budget balances and quotes are in. Balancing the budget, you can include guesswork, but the income has got to total the same as the expenditure unless the project specifies something different. If you change the budget in the budget page, check to make sure there isn't a question at the front of the form that asks what funds you are asking for. If there is, change that as well. Have you got your letters of support and quotes? Who leaves their letters of support until the last minute, then finds they have to write them on behalf of the partners and sponsors who then just sign and send back? And get sign-off by management and organisational contacts. The final declaration. This is the legal permission to apply on behalf of the organisation. So if you've put this application together and then your chair or committee doesn't want a bar of it, then you've wasted your time. So let's recap. The 5 strategies. Unpack the guidelines. Plan your project realistically. Budget, budget, budget. Put application and trust into your application. Put quality and trust into your application. Put your application together, tying up the loose ends, and, sorry guys, there's number 6. Submit the application and accompanying documents. Why have I included that? because I am aware of organisations that have put a lot of time and energy into putting the application together, and then for some reason they forgot to submit, or they tried to submit after the deadline. There may be technical reasons. Contact the funding body in those instances, but more often than not, a deadline is a deadline. So how will this information help you triple your chances of success? Grants that meet your organisational purpose and need, as well as the outcomes required by the funding body. That's a win-win situation. Using these strategies, you'll demonstrate properly planned projects and resources and timelines. Your project is more likely to succeed if it is well planned, because funding bodies like projects that are successful. Properly costed budgets that cover real costs. Again, your project is likely to succeed if it is properly budgeted and funded. Improving ability to submit well-prepared applications, demonstrating you know what you're talking about and capable of running the project. Once you demonstrate that you've delivered a good project, you're more likely to get